So good evening and good morning to some of us. And it was, we had been hoping for this to happen, and well in time that Ashok notified us to have this nominated. And then there was this big announcement of Ashok's book, Monopsony Capitalism, having won this huge award, which is really the best thing that could happen for the book. Interestingly, a number of parallel submissions had been made from the press, some of the titles that were commissioned by the India Editorial Center and some other books that were done by the UK office as well. So it was a tough and narrow competition because press books were competing with each other, and that was really the high point for us as the editors. And I couldn't be happier that it is Ashok's book that has won this, because we have been working on this for the longest time. It has been a few years in the making. So really, as much applause as we can have for Ashok. And just a few words about the series to which this book belongs. We have been working on this, the series of development trajectories in global value chains since 2014. And we have just entered the second phase for it, which really has opened up a number of more possibilities for it. There is a wider, more varied group of editors now. And I'll be posting all the links very shortly. So anybody who might be interested in looking at the series board, what kind of work we are doing, how much has been published so far, and what we are looking to do in the second phase, all of those details will be available. I will also be posting details of whom you can approach if you want to make a submission to the series, or independently, if you think your work would fit in within the publishing program of the press at large, you can do so. Again, just a couple of words about the series, that it has been, as the studies on GVCs, GCCs, and GPNs expand, this series is distinguished because of its focus on the implications of new production systems. And we have tried to open it up and include contributions from all disciplines and interdisciplinary fields. In this way, it has been quite a unique approach. In the beginning, we did have some apprehension about how well received it is going to be, but it would be more of a delight to me that it has expanded so well, with all the support from series editors so far and with the new editors on board now. This was just a very brief introduction to Ashok's recent big achievement, the series. And now I'm going to hand it over to Professor Barringers to come in and take over from here with an introduction of the panels.
Thank you very much, Anwisha, and thank you to Cambridge University Press for hosting this Author Meets Critics. My name is Stephanie Barrientos at the University of Manchester. I'll be chairing the session. Firstly, we're going to start with Ashok Kumar, who is going to give a brief overview of his book, which has been widely commended and is proving both controversial but also very popular, which is excellent. We will then have three critics who will give short reviews, both positive and critical. We've encouraged them to be critical as well as positive. Firstly, there'll be Jennifer Baer from the University of Virginia, and then Matthew Cole from the Fair Work Foundation and Oxford Internet Institute, and Dev Nathan from the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. After that, we'll open it up to participants to make comments, ask questions, etc. And then Ashok will respond to all the different comments that he's received. So I think we'll proceed, Ashok, if that's okay with you. You're in mute.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Yeah, I just thanks Stephanie for that introduction, and Jen for organizing this as well, Anwisha from CUP, and Matt and Dev for offering to respond to the book. Yeah, so I'm gonna maybe just, because I just get into the kind of the book itself. The book is sort of an attempt to explain the durability of the sweatshop and kind of the underlying logic within capitalism, which means that these conditions, and indeed, the composition of capital, but also the subjective agency of the working class, are not fixed categories, they change. The book begins at the collapse in April 2013 in Dhaka, Bangladesh, many of you know, where 1,129 mostly women were crushed to death at Rana Plaza. And it begins there to highlight that these conditions clearly have gotten worse in many respects, but also that the sort of innumerable kind of the multi-stakeholder agreements and codes of conducts and audit regimes, by many accounts, have not really proven to have dented the kind of unrelenting immiseration of workers in these sectors, these sort of labor-intensive sectors, like garments and footwear and certain kinds of shoes and furniture and so on. So the book makes kind of two primary theoretical claims. The first centers around the phenomenon of monopsony, which is the title of the book, which is basically a buyer's market, and it sort of centers around a kind of the logical direction in which value chains or supply chains go in because of the underlying logics of competition. And the second one relates to the kind of spatial or disruptive power of workers and the structural power changing in reflection of that, the first kind of theoretical intervention. So one is about the changing composition of capitalism and in terms of supply chains, and the second one is around the changing structural powers of workers as a response to that. So I want to firstly kind of explain some of the structural factors, and I know that many people are aware of this here, but that make these kind of sweatshop sectors more durable. I guess just to start, I think there's a lot of theorizing, especially around what is and isn't a sweatshop. I think I don't really focus that much attention on that, even though it kind of plays front and center. It's kind of like, for simplicity, it's a workplace with very low bargaining power, typically in manufacturing, typically with a high ratio of labor to capital, a kind of low organic composition of capital. And you kind of know it when you see it. So that it doesn't spend, I don't spend that much time really defining that, but in the garment and footwear sectors, is primarily these are considered sweatshop sectors because they're low value, low technology, vertically disintegrated and buyer driven. So a monopsony is, like I suggested, it's a buyer's market, so it's very few buyers and many sellers. So the garment sector, that means that a few large brands like Nike, Adidas, H&M, so on, can choose for tens of thousands of sellers and producers around the world. This is kind of, I think, a kind of inverse of monopoly. It's that a monopolistic relationship typically is a horizontal relationship, whereas a monopsonistic relationship is usually a vertical relationship. And so the claims of the book is that the products that are produced inform the production process, and the production process then opens up the possibility for workers in terms of disruptive potential. And in one of my classes, when I'm talking about the history of industrial capitalism, I sort of have two images of and I end the book in this way, but the two images of separated by 100 years of the garment sector and the auto sector. And if you look at the auto sector, you'll have basically workers working around a supply chain, assembly line 100 years ago, and then you look now and you can barely see any workers. It's just very technologically advanced. And whereas in the garment sector, it's basically women crouching over sewing machines 100 years ago and now. And so it's kind of so there have been sort of low barriers to entry, which means that if you're a capitalist in India or Cambodia, if you wanted to open up a footwear factory 30 years ago, it might cost you £1 million. An export-oriented footwear factory with like thousands of workers, or even a garment factory now. Whereas if you want to do an automobile factory, it might cost you 100 million. Aeronautics plant, $1 billion. So those low barriers to entry inform and increase the monopsony relationship, increase the possibility of, as capital expands, as borders get liberalized, more and more potential capitalists get into the sectors that they're able to get into. So that's why it's been described as a starter sector, because emergent capitalists aren't able to get into, open up an aeronautics plant. They can open up a garment factory potentially. So these low barriers of entry means that you've had this high degree of monopsony power, which has then meant that it's intensified the competition between these suppliers. That intense competition has meant that there's very low value that's being captured at the point of production, and that low value means that these factories those low margins can never escape the orbit of low technology and low value, which means that workers they don't have the wiggle room to make greater demands at the point of production. So these are things that we know, right? We have this kind of distanciation between areas of value production and value capture. And so the theory that I put forward, and I also try and demonstrate and defend, it begins really basically right after I talk about Rana Plaza. I was in South India. I was at translating for a kind of international workers' rights organization that was doing an investigation at a factory that had been a protracted struggle in a small dusty town called Ramnagara. And it's one of the cases in the book, but basically I was asked to translate because there had been quite a bit of violence there for the person who was investigating. So I spent about 3 days just translating from Kannada to English, English to Kannada. And what we knew about the sector is that, what the dynamic, and as Gary Jeffrey and others have described for decades now, is, you have this dynamic where it's buyer driven. So the people who are the sort of power brokers in the supply chain are the H&Ms and the Nikes and the Adidas, and it's not the sort of factory owner. But then over the course of the 3 days, I witnessed, executives of the factory, Arvind factory is a large denim producer, run roughshod over the representative who'd come from PVH, Phil Van Housen, one of the largest shirt manufacturers in the world, owns like Calvin Klein and others. And I thought maybe this is it felt really weird because it wasn't something I had read in the books. It was very, very clear where the dynamics of power lie. And so on the way back, while I was sitting with the investigator, who'd done many investigations, really for at least 15 years, I was like, that was a weird dynamic. The person from PVH really wasn't saying anything. It was kind of like following the lead of the person from Arvind. And he said, that's a dynamic I've been noticing more and more of. So I was like, okay, that's where it begins, like the kind of investigation of it. So basically the theory goes like this, that, deregulation, so the forms of deregulation, which we saw from the end of the multi-fiber agreement, creates high degrees of monopsony power, right? As you're able to deregulate, as you have more areas and more freedom for capital to concentrate in different places without needing to produce in different places, which is what the multi-fiber agreement led to. You had clothes being produced in the far-flung corners of the globe. You then have it creates higher degrees of monopsony power, right? Because all of a sudden they're able to maximize it. As that deregulation happens in the initial years, that monopsony power increases, which increases the share of value to the lead firm, to the buyers in this case, the brands and retailers. This intensifies competition and exerts downward pressure on the value chain by lowering the source price. So that, the price demanded by these now ever increasingly powerful brands is, demanding less and less for a shirt or a tie or a shoe to be produced, which decreases the number of firms able to compete. And over time, it lowers the monopsony power, right? Because weak firms go into the red and larger firms kind of gobble up their kind of market power. This falling degree of monopsony power leads to a consolidation, which increases the value share captured by the surviving suppliers. And then consolidation increases the vertical and horizontal integration and automation, which raises the barriers to entry. So what you're seeing, and I do a number of cases, that you see that the number of, especially in the sort of most valorized sections of these sectors. So those parts that can be most standardized, and the places that they can be most standardized are the ones that aren't really aren't really sort of bogged down by the same kinds of concerns around seasonality and ephemeral fashion trends. So like men's undergarments, which is one of the cases, or denim, which can become technologically more advanced and more valorized more easily because it doesn't have the same kinds of constrictions around seasonality and, well, maybe seasonality, but less so, and fashion trends. And shoes. Shoes is a prime example of this. And shoes also wasn't tied into the MFA. So it was able to sort of be a kind of almost like a canary in the coal mine for the thesis that applies to the MFA after the MFA ended in 2005. So what happens is that now you're, as this process is happening, imagine you're that Indian or Cambodian capitalist trying to enter into the footwear sector now, not 30 years ago, but now. It might not cost you $1 million, it might cost you $1.5 million or $2 million to get into that, to get into that sector. And what that does, that raising the barriers to entry increases the disruptive power. It increases the power of those suppliers, but then it in effect increases the power of workers to disrupt at the point of production, which then, obviously means that they're not as easily replaceable by the lead firms. So I go through a few kind of examples of this, but I kind of wanted to talk a little bit briefly about the second claim, which is that there are kind of two forms of spatial kind of inflexibility. There's that I try to identify, which is one is regulatory and the other is market. So under the frame of regulatory spatial inflexibility, you have, this is kind of the period of embedded liberalism, which is the end of World War II to the 1970s, the crisis of the 70s. You have a high degree of regulatory in spatial inflexibility because you have states that regulate the movement of capital, but also, that's the primary reason, which means that there's limits on the monopsonistic relationship that the lead firm can have. So then, workers were able to exploit that. And so as that ends in the 1970s, you have the emergence of what we call globalization. Then you have a period of greater exploitation and ever increasing forms of monopsony relationships in terms of, in the US, for example, it moves from like Manhattan to New Jersey to Canada in the South, where it's right to work, or California. And then by the 1970s and beyond, it moves to, sort of the maquilas of Mexico and then Central America. Then obviously, the rest of the story. But basically then it moves towards a sort of market logic. So this is a more market spatial inflexibility. As you have the consolidation and concentration of capital at the point of production, increased investment at the point of production, it means that you have greater sunk costs, increased barriers to entry, increased fixed capital investment. This also means that it increases the potential bargaining power of workers. But it's a kind of complicated story, right? It's not as easy as to say that it just simply increases in this kind of it's not just a linear process of, investment, increased bargaining power, right? But so I'll just quickly talk about the different cases. I look at this sort of ILGWU. I look at, great work that, Jen's done and others have done on this, but I just sort of, if you look at that period, you had the ILGWU making demands that don't necessarily disrupt this three-part system. It makes these jobbers agreements that make demands at the point of production, at the factory owner, and then at the point of retail, because that's accessible and they could put pressure on them, and then they force them to have a contract that ring fences living wages. So basically by the late 1930s, as they've identified, garment workers were making as much as auto workers, right? Which is basically hasn't been repeated before that and was unprecedented at that time. But what that does is it doesn't necessarily disrupt this three-part system of outsourced production. And that's just sort of illustrative, but one of the cases I start off with is the case of Hugh Wen, which is in 2014, 50,000 workers over social insurance went on strike at the largest footwear producer in the world. 1 in 6 shoes in the world, casual and sports shoes are produced there. It was the largest strike of a private sector employer in Chinese history. And, what was important about that is that the brands like Nike and Adidas who are exclusively producing there didn't cut and run because the capacity and economies of scale there made it more prohibitive for them to move, which was, again, quite unprecedented, right? So Hu Yuan needs Nike almost as much as Nike needs Hu Yuan. So, they lost, 27 million in concessions, even though the workers didn't get what they demanded. And it cost the company 31 million in terms of the actual strike. It was 6 months later, you had the largest private sector strike at the UN facility in Vietnam. It was the largest private sector strike in Vietnamese history. They won all their demands around social insurance, but those were demands put on the state. There's a different sort of organization and regulatory system around pensions there. The second case I look at is Arvind, the case I began with, which is, the third largest denim manufacturer in the world. It's an exclusive producer for Philip Van Housen. And there was a kind of protracted union struggle there. And because of it was in this facility was a kind of a warehouse. So there was less investment at that point. It wasn't a point in the supply chain that saw greater investment in terms of technology. So the company simply reorganized production. It effectively was able to defang the struggle of the worker struggle by moving it from a core facility, which is a pressing warehouse, which is they produce and it goes out to retailers, to a returns warehouse. So, you return something and it goes back there and it gets repackaged. So that's from a core facility to a peripheral function, which they were able to do because of their size and capacity. And they were also able to replace workers with very expensive interstate workers. They were able to house them in dormitories, which are expensive. They were able to hire strongmen, which are expensive. So again, this is a complicated story. It's not simply you have strong, you have a strong, suppliers, and all of a sudden it means that workers automatically get greater power. It also means powerful suppliers to disrupt and demoralize workers organizing. Lastly, look at Fruit of the Loom, a largest employer in Honduras. This is vertically integrated, and the reason why it's important to also talk about why vertically integrated production is because it's vertically integrated precisely because of the particular product that's being produced. It's not tied. I mean, this is mainly undergarments, men's undergarments, these facilities. And, there was again, a protracted struggle, a massive transnational solidarity campaign, which cost the company quite heavily. This is Fruit of the Loom, Russell Athletic facility, but owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And then the union won union recognition. The workers won that, and they've won recognition at a number of other facilities since then. And in their contracts, they win about 70% higher wages than garment workers in the region. But yeah, I guess I'll just end it there. I think my time's probably up. Or close to up. I would just say that, I want to thank again the book series editors for accepting the book and allowing me to write this. And then also, I think, and publishing it, I think for me, the book ends with I take kind of George Lucas's History and Class Consciousness, where he talks about, we really are able to analyze, and capital makes visible its sort of innards, or its in its totality, mostly in moments of rupture or moments of disruption. And it's the strikes and disruption are kind of, that's the heuristic in which I'm looking at. It's like, you look at the strike, you look at the disruption, and you see how capital responds, and we're able to then understand the changing dynamics or composition of capital and what that means for worker organization. And that's the kind of purpose of the book, is to analyze capital for the purposes of effectively organizing workers under capitalism. So thanks again. And yeah, I'll end it there. Excellent.
Thanks very much, Ashok. That was a very lively overview of the book. So I'll now pass to Jennifer Bear, who's going to give the first of the critical reviews. You're on mute.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Ashok, for writing such a great book, and Washa and her team for publishing it. So this book really beautifully combines insights from the corpus of GVC literature broadly conceived, but also critically It does something that I think not all of us working in the GVC tradition do as much or as well as we should, which is integrate the insights of other analytical traditions. So this book is really centering the analysis of GVCs within a broader analysis of the structural dynamics of global capitalism. So the influence of Gary Jaffe and Will Milberg are clear here, but Ashok also expertly draws on the work of David Harvey, Eric Olin Wright, and Malcolm Sawyer as well. So in my view, the single most important contribution of this terrific book is this. It really leverages GVC analysis as a method for analyzing both the relationship between capitals and the relationship between capital and labor. It approaches the relationship between firms in a global value chain as a question of power. So it really brings power into the discussion of governance. And Ashok makes clear that buyer-driven governance is ultimately about the bargaining power of the buyer over the supplier, right? So that of commercial capital in the form of global brands and retailers over industrial capital in the form of manufacturers. And it's a shift in this bargaining power that leads Ashok to the provocative claim in the subtitle that we're in the twilight of the sweatshop age. Now, Ashok's argument is that the modern era of sweatshops coincided with the phase out of the multi-fiber arrangement, which dramatically expanded the spatial flexibility of the brands to play suppliers off each other. In this phase, buyers enjoy high monopsony power, which they exercise by pushing buyers to keep prices low. So suppliers have to compete with each other by trying to minimize production costs. And it's this competition within the supply base that basically drives sweatshop conditions. Because suppliers are replaceable, they have little bargaining power over brands, and workers employed by their suppliers in turn have little bargaining power over their employers. And labor militancy isn't really much help in this scenario, since there's essentially little surplus for the supplier to redistribute. So the crux of the argument in the book here is that over time, this competition drives a consolidation in the supply base as smaller suppliers are wiped out. The remaining suppliers get bigger and more capable, and the increasing economies of scale and scope in the value chain make them more valuable to buyers. So eventually the buyer-driven chain in which the supplier is dependent on the buyer evolves into a situation of what Ashok calls buyer-producer symbiosis, in which the relationship is characterized not by domination, but by mutual dependence. So one question I have as an aside is just how that is different from what Jaffe, Humphrey, and Sturgeon would call relational governance. At any rate, as suppliers gain power vis-a-vis brands, that is, as the relationship between these capitals becomes more symmetrical, labor gains bargaining power vis-a-vis capital. So this is an elegant model, and it incorporates, I think, so many of the most significant shifts in value chains today, most notably the consolidation that's happening at the production end of the chain, but also the declining importance of kind of the classic north-south global value chain in favor of increased south-south trade, which is reflecting both the growth of large mega suppliers that kind of launch their own brands for Southern markets, and then, of course, relatedly, the increasing importance of Southern consumers. I do have a couple of questions, though, about sort of both parts of the argument. First, I think Ashok overstates the degree to which value relations between buyers and suppliers is shifting. So consolidation is happening, and there may well be a degree of increased symbiosis between buyers and suppliers, but I don't think that there's yet much in the way of empirical evidence to support the claim that, quote, greater value capture at the producer end is dramatically altering questions of power and production. Now, it's certainly true that there are winners and losers emerging from horizontal competition among suppliers, and that a small set of highly competent transnational manufacturers are becoming increasingly important suppliers to global brands. But I'm not yet convinced that the same is true for sort of the vertical dynamics in the chain. That is, that suppliers are capturing greater value at the expense of the buyers. And I think one limitation here, though I wouldn't necessarily say it's a weakness, it's just that the model is really focused on industrial capitalism. So, there's a lot of emphasis on the rising organic composition of capital, but this focus on production, while consistent with the overall, kind of Marxist analytic here, isn't necessarily well suited to apprehend the dynamics of value chains in which intangible assets, like intellectual property rights as barriers to entry, are increasingly critical for market power and the generation and management of profits. So the dynamics of monopsony capitalism offered here really seem to be focused on like sort of the bottom of the famous smile curve. That is the place where value capture along the chain is actually lowest. So one question I would have then is how this argument jives basically with the process of financialization and its implications for global value chains and what Seabrook and Wigan call global wealth chains. Okay, so turning then to the second part of the argument, I want to raise some questions about Ashok's argument regarding the increase in labor's bargaining power. Okay, I have some questions here too. I mean, I think first they're the scope conditions, and he's pretty upfront about these. These benefits are going to be limited to a relatively small handful of mega suppliers in a small number of countries. And the thing is that these producers may, as in fact we learn in the book Arvin is already doing, actually outsource their own brand production for the domestic market to smaller manufacturers, suggesting that to some degree competitive pressures are being kind of passed down the chain. But the other point that I want to raise here is that I don't know that consolidation necessarily means spatial inflexibility, right? So again, as we learn in the book, these are transnational suppliers and they have facilities in a number of countries, and they can still play workers off each other within their own network. But my main question is really about the three cases of labor struggle in the book and sort of how they relate to the main argument. It's hard to see these cases as ones that sort of augur an increase of labor's bargaining power vis-a-vis employers. Now, I guess the fact that the brands didn't cut and run is supposed to be indicative of increasing supplier power and therefore consistent with the overall argument. But at least two of these three cases don't necessarily seem to be victories for labor. I think the only one that can clearly be called a success case is the case study focused on the struggle waged by the Honduran union, the CTG, against Fruit of the Loom. Yet this case doesn't seem a very good one to support the theory, because Fruit of the Loom is not a relatively recent mega supplier that's emerged from competition and consolidation that occurred after the MFA. It's a mature multinational that is critically a brand as well as a vertically integrated manufacturer. So this is a great case study, but my reading of it suggests that what was important here wasn't only that Fruit of the Loom, had a relatively high degree of spatial inflexibility due to its ownership of factories, but also that it was highly susceptible to the strategic campaign that sort of involved like a brilliant tag team coordination, where you had a well-established local union sort of working in tandem with international allies organizing through USAS to put pressure actually on the ultimate buyer, which are universities, through the Workers' Rights Consortium. So I was confused really by the emphasis that's put in the book on the growing importance of direct negotiations with employers rather than campaigns targeting brands. Since to some degree this seems inconsistent with the data even presented in this chapter, much of which emphasizes how the Fruit of the Loom case was important because it opened direct negotiations between the union, CGT, and Nike and Adidas, right? So those are brands. And in each case, the branded buyers were critical. Along similar lines, I was confused by the conclusion in the discussion, the conclusion about the situation in post-Rana Plaza, Bangladesh. This is something I would love to hear Ashok say more about. So I think this is an interesting case for sure to kind of think about the argument. On the one hand, you could argue that the ultimate success of the domestic apparel industry in preventing the continued operation of the Accord or its expansion to other issue areas beyond health and safety, for example, to freedom of association, is indeed evidence of the growing power of Bangladeshi suppliers vis-a-vis buyers, right? In the sense that buyers seem not to have pushed hard enough for its renewal, at least not to the point of making, their continued sourcing out of Bangladesh contingent on the Accord's renewal. But it's really hard to see that as an outcome that's positive for workers. And, labor militancy in Bangladesh, of which there's plenty, has for the most part been suppressed, sometimes quite violently, by a government that is keenly interested in keeping production costs low. We learn in the book that there was an increase in union registrations in 2013, but that was actually following Rana Plaza and the negotiation of the Sustainability Compact with the European Union. And although there was this really significant increase in union registrations, that trend actually came to a pretty abrupt halt as the kind of spotlight effect of Rana Plaza dimmed. So I think my point here is, and I think that actually Ashok would agree, that producers capturing a greater share of value, like maybe in some sense a necessary condition for ending sweatshops, but it's not at all a sufficient one. And in this sense, I think I ultimately agree. If I'm reading this correctly, I think that Ashok is suggesting that the most promising kind of strategy to pursue, sort of is the one developed by the International Union for Brand Solidarity, which attempts to kind of recreate at a global level the jobbers agreement pioneered by the IGLW in the 1930s, although again, with the idea that you would be putting increasing emphasis on direct negotiations, with employers that would have, as a result of the decline of monopsony power, a greater surplus to potentially to share with labor. The last point I want to make is just that the state was a really important part of the jobbers agreement story that I don't think comes through well enough in the analysis. It's true that this strategy was pioneered by the ILGW relatively early in the 20th century, but actually the union had a really hard time getting companies to sign these contracts until the labor law reforms, under Roosevelt, basically, the National Labor Relations Act. And so in that sense, I think there is a bit of a, without necessarily wading into the relationship between kind of the state and capital, I think as we think about what this might imply for the increase in labor's power in places like China, there is, I think, this really critical question of the degree to which the environment for freedom of association is one that enables labor to exercise its power.
Great, thanks very much, Jen. Some really, really insightful points that you're raising. Matthew Cole, will you now just approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to Dev Nathan.
Thanks. Yeah, so I have a few points that some of which touch on similar themes that Jennifer just raised, but I think the book does a great job of like schematizing value change in a dialectical way, which I think is a really important sort of methodological approach that can get lost sometimes in certain kinds of social science research. So I pulled out like a few key concepts. Obviously it hinges around degree of monopsony power, but the sort of degree of oligopoly power and oligopsony power sort of feed into this, and the sort of degree of spatial inflexibility. Ashok refers to regulatory DSI, which is sort of more sort of geographic and sort of geopolitical state kinds of constraints, and then market DSI, which is fairly sort of, it's linked more, I guess, to technology and available materials and things like that. But I broadly agree with everything in the book. It was nice to see some of the references to United Students Against Sweatshops, that an organization I worked with when I was an undergrad way back when. But what I was sort of trying to think through how the theories actually apply in the context of global platformization and sort of digital platforms and digitalization, and then the way that this market-leading business model has shifted accumulation and value production or extraction, right? So, I mean, many people are familiar with the literature on platforms. I don't really need to sort of hopefully explain it too much, but the largest 7 out of the 10 most valuable firms in the world are all these sort of digital platform companies: Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, etc. And the most visible end of that tends to be labor platforms, Uber, for example. And what I was trying to think about is how the degree of spatial inflexibility relates to degree of monopsony power in the context of platforms. Because it seems to me that platforms largely negate the degree of spatial inflexibility as a factor because cloud computing, most of the sort of offices largely, some of them are run out of WeWork spaces. They're not geographically tethered. Sometimes, like in the case of Uber, they don't even use the labor laws that apply in the particular country. Like Uber's terms and conditions are based in the Netherlands, and they use those in the UK. They can, other companies like Deliveroo, these sort of companies, they can just leave at the drop of the hat without losing any of their any significant amount of their fixed capital, because so much of their value and leverage is based in these sort of intangible assets that were mentioned earlier, the intellectual property, data sets, and so on. So if we sort of agree on that, and so spatial inflexibility doesn't really hinge as a factor on the sort of I guess buyer or maybe supplier end. I mean, sometimes it's hard because these platforms are they're buyers of labor power and suppliers of services, and there are several different kinds of chains that go into the business model. A being, technology itself, from rare earth mining, which is, notorious for having tens of thousands of suppliers of different parts and everything. But then there's another factor, which is the sort of data supply chains that these platforms need to run, which are also not spatially bound at all. They're largely, they rely on data exhaust from the apps that we use, and armies of very low-paid, insecure cloud workers in largely low and middle-income countries and the developing world. So all of this kind of obviously gives platforms a very high degree of monopsony power, but I almost wonder if this isn't enough of a descriptor to describe, or this isn't enough of a concept to really get at what is sort of driving this value production and extraction. Because so obviously, if you've read some of the emerging literature around intellectual property, intangible assets, and so on, theories of rent are back in fashion. You have political economists, sociologists, all kinds of people looking at technoscience rent and rent extraction, and which is not as sort of traditional, part of the industrial circuit as theorized in Marx and in Industrial Capital. It's much more closer to this sort of financialized extractivist model. And this kind of poses I guess a challenge to some of the theory presented in the book, because I guess in Ashok's framework, the degree of monopsony power would, the greater the value capture, I can't remember what the word you used to describe it actually, but in mainstream economics, it's like a market rent. Like if they're extracting more value than the sort of their competitors, right? And that has to do with like power and their like market share and so on. This sort of concept doesn't seem to fit in, or I'm not sure where it would fit in. So I was wondering, maybe, when Ashok responds, he could talk about that, because the kind of rent that extracted as well is quite it's quite specific to the platform model. It's been theorized in a number of different ways. Monopoly rent, drawing on Harvey and so on, is a sort of lens through which I sort of theorize it as well. But it's not the same as a sort of fixed asset, right? Because land, for example, has a fixed recurring use and establishes consistency against future claims. Machinery, another asset, fixed capital, depreciates in value over time. However, intangible assets don't really conform to either of these things. So it's like the intellectual property rights and data sets that are absolutely necessary for platforms, and integral to their valuation, and all these companies are valued higher than any other companies. They don't really depreciate and they're not fixed. So essentially, much of the value is just by denying access. And so I'm not sure if you could call that a higher degree of monopsony power, or if it necessitates another sort of an addition to this sort of framework. So yeah, and then another sort of comment was, which is also sort of touched on a little bit, is the fact that the producer-buyer symbiosis that in this framework should be achieved, I guess, eventually through competition, doesn't seem to jive with the way that the persistence of underdevelopment in Africa and sort of Southeast Asia and so on, and particularly in relation to how digital infrastructure and the sort of platform infrastructure is spreading and developing there, which just simply reproduces underdevelopment because the data supply, the labor supply in the cloud work, and the infrastructure itself is all owned largely by Amazon Web Services, Google, or Western countries. So even if you have a platform like Jumia, which is big in West Africa and East Africa, this is not owned by African countries, or and it doesn't sort of feed back into the value of those economies. And you basically have the same similar sort of dynamics operating that you would have in these sort of more like sweatshop and traditional industries, but there's no degree of spatial inflexibility really here, and I don't see how the producer-buyer symbiosis could ever be sort of achieved in that situation. So yeah, and then I guess another area that I think the book could, or the theory could be expanded upon is in the sort of role of the state, but this was already raised by Jennifer. So I think I haven't actually kept time.
Yep, no, you're doing, I'm keeping, you're just doing perfect. And that brings it back to where the point Jennifer raised at the end. So a lot of food for thought here, Ashok. I hope you're keeping a good tab. There's going to be a lot for you to respond to, but you probably won't be able to respond to it all. Nathan, Dev, you're still muted, so if you could give your review. Dev, you're muted. Dev, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, I've unmuted. Yeah, congratulations to Ashok for a very important book. I would like to make 3 points. One is I would support the position of monopsony capitalism as distinct from monopoly capitalism that Baran and Sweezy spoke about in the earlier phase of the global capitalist world. Secondly, I would disagree with Ashok on the question of how supplier size changes the relationship. I don't see a change, to put it briefly, in any change in the rates of return of large and small suppliers. They remain about the same. It's only the size that changes. And third, I would dispute the point about the end of sweatshops with this type of dialectical development within the monopsony capitalist without a hard regulatory regime, which we don't have. what Jen referred to as the importance of the state in the jobbers agreement. We have nothing like that, which can bring it about at the international level that we are dealing with. First, the point about monopsony. I think it's very important what Ashok has done, and which, well, some of us have also done it in our own work recently, and also in the new book, which is coming out in this series from Cambridge, which we call Reverse Subsidies in Monopsony Capitalism. So there too, the point is that we are in a situation which was pointed out by people like Richard Freeman and others a long time ago, that look, we have suddenly doubled the world's working force, labor force, which was otherwise within national economies. With the opening up of China, with the opening up of India a little later, with the end of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Freeman put it, the world's labor force doubled, while the capital did not double. So there would obviously be an effect upon labor conditions. This is what created at one level monopsony capitalism, the introduction of large numbers of the world's working people who were otherwise within their national economies into a kind of globalized labor force, which has now spread not just from Asia and Latin America, but also to Africa. So that's the first point. This is important in terms of it. This is also, it ties up with what Gary pointed out a long time ago when he made this distinction between the buyer-driven supply chains and the technology-driven supply chains. What we're looking at, buyer-driven is what? Is a monopsony. So that is exactly the point, that these are monopsonies, and we really have a new world now of monopsony capitalism. This has been taken even forward by the platform economy that Matthew has looked into, and I've been looking at it in terms of India. And now we have, earlier on we talk about Nike and all of these as being shoe sellers without any factories. These were brands without factories. Now we have in the platforms, well, I don't know what to call them. These are hyper enterprises with nothing but a platform, which is a piece of software. But they are at the interface between where you can get the money. That's where the money, you're able to capture the value through that interface and through the data analysis that you're able to have, what Zuboff called, the term is, sorry. Yeah, anyway, that where you're able to bring the data of the consumers together, put it across platforms and utilize that to capture a large part of the value. So now you have, I've been seeing in India, I'm sure the numbers would be more in other parts of the world, you have Uber having 1.5 million drivers, and you have an Indian taxi company with 1.2 million drivers, Ola. And you have food delivery companies with 500,000 workers, delivery suppliers. These are huge monopsonies, which did not exist earlier. And that's a new thing that we have developed. Now we have even hyper monopsonies, if I may put it like that. We have hyper enterprises which are monopolies across sectors and bring them together, and we have hyper monopsonies created. The second point related to this, which I think is not stressed enough in Ashok's analysis, is that monopsony also depends on monopoly. You have to be a monopolist in the product market if you want to be a monopolist in the labor or the input market. So the brands are also monopolies. The platforms are also IPR protected monopolies. And here's the important point, that without IPR protection, without the ability to turn your knowledge into an exclusionary monopoly where the others cannot use it, you cannot get a higher return. If your knowledge, however valuable it is in terms of itself, its own understanding of the world, only the monopolized knowledge is able to get a higher rate of return compared to the non-monopolized, what we call the commoditized knowledge. So I think monopoly is a critical part of the understanding of monopsony. Second, size did not make a difference to the rates of return. When we looked at over a long period of time, garment manufacturers in India of different sizes, small, medium, large, we did not find, after the end of the MFA, we did not find any difference in the rates of return. They are around the same 8 to 10%, which is like the competitive rate of return. and it remained like that. What we did know is that when there was an MFA, when brands had to supply from different countries, the rates of return of even small garment manufacturers and medium ones were actually much higher at 25%, because of the fact that there was a monopoly confronting the monopsony, and they were able to get those higher rates of return. But after the MFA ended, rates of return have then been around 8 to 10% and have remained at that level. So therefore, unless you have a producer like Arvind, which, as Ashok pointed out, is one of the largest producers of denim, is not just size, but it's also tacit knowledge, the ability to produce a very complicated product. Denim is not a simple piece of fabric. It is a difficult to manufacture fabric. So unless you have some form of monopoly knowledge which you're able to utilize, you cannot get a higher rate of return as a supplier. You see this in the suppliers in the auto industry. Only those with like the Bosch or the steering systems or the braking systems, only they, which have been called the choke point technologies, they are able to get a higher rate of return. You may be very large like Foxconn, you may have 1 million workers, but Foxconn's rate of return is only 3 to 5% as compared to 50% for Apple, for whom they manufacture the product. So the rate of return does not change with the size. Volume changes. The workers are able to get a little bit more, and that's what is the benefit that Ashok is pointing to. But here I would make a distinction between two kinds of change. One is incremental change, and the other is transformative. What Ashok is pointing to when he talks of the end of the sweatshop is a transformative change, which changes the relation between labor and capital at the level of the suppliers' factories, the kind of thing that happened with the jobbers agreement. What is the critical point of this transformation? I would put it as the acceptance of living wages as the wage standard. Now, what do we find in all of these cases that were taken up in the book and also elsewhere? That all the multi stakeholder initiatives, etc., have all led to small bits of incremental change. Wages still remain in all supplier countries around the national minimum wage, whether it is the Chinese garment manufacturers or the Sri Lankan or the Indian, they still remain around the national minimum wage, which is hardly 1/3 to 50% of the living wage. So I don't think that just a simple change in the size, even in Arvind, it's not as though their wages have become living wages. They have not. They are a little better, about 10% higher than the wage, including other benefits. Some of the benefits are not directly as wages, but they can be monetized. And we can say that there's about a 10% difference between the larger suppliers. Besides Arvind, there are others also who have higher wages, who have higher proportions of permanent workers in their workforce, who give some various kinds of side benefits. All of that together makes for a somewhat better improvement in the working conditions, but does not make for the transformative change, which is the end of sweatshops. So I think that there is a problem with saying that the change in the size of the suppliers would end sweatshops. I think we will need, like Jennifer pointed out, we will need the state, but unfortunately now it's not just the state. We do need international institutions, an inter-country agreement to be able to bring this out. And there's only one industry where there has been some change like this, and that is, there's the Maritime Labor Convention, which was set up in a few years ago, and which actually has a 3-tier wage system, one for the high-income countries, another for emerging or middle-income countries, and a third wage system for the low-income countries, the flags of convenience countries. It also has an implementation mechanism, unlike other ILO conventions. All national port authorities are allowed to inspect and detain a ship if they find labor and environmental conditions being violated. We need something similar if we are able to move in a situation of monopsony capitalism, I would come back to this. If Ashok's analysis of monopsony capitalism, then they will not get out of the sweatshops as easily as it is put forward in his analysis. But it's important because it raises the question of how do we bring change in a world which is now not monopoly capitalism alone, but a dual monopoly of monopoly and monopsony capitalism, confronting sellers and these manufacturers, and plus the huge workforce which is trying to get into these jobs. So I think while it is important to take forward what Ashok has put here, monopsony capitalism, we need to come up with a lot more. It'll help us to push it forward by bringing things like the intellectual property rights and the international regulation that is necessary to overcome sweatshop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dev. And thank you to all the critics. So I'm going to open it up and Rashad, can I open it up to if there are any queries or questions or
Yes, please.
just short contributions? Put your hand up or put it in the chat. Not seeing any.
Gary has a question, I think so.
Yeah, I can't see him actually. Sorry about this. I'm just not seeing it. But Gary, please go ahead.
Sure. I think Ashok has plenty to address with the excellent comments. Let me just make two quick observations. One, I would fully agree with what how Jen had framed it, where I think monopsony capitalism is very similar to what we were identifying as buyer-driven chains as a shift from the producer-driven logic. And at the point where that first started to occur in the 1970s, 1980s, there really was a big asymmetry between the much greater organization of retailers and brands and the very fragmented nature of production, especially because in industries like apparel, even in footwear, but apparel, it was, you had the multi-fiber arrangement and all. And so in that case, regulation actually was underpinning monopsony capitalism. And then what started to happen in 2001 with WTO allowing China to come in and other forces in the 2000s, early 2000s, was a much bigger consolidation, both a number of key exporting countries, let's go back, stay with apparel, or footwear, which ended up being 4 or 5 with China and Bangladesh and Vietnam and a couple of others. And as you point out with Arvind and other cases, a much greater rise of supplier power. The top producers became much more consolidated as apparel providers, and even the trading companies like Li and Fang themselves became more consolidated. So I guess the question would be, how different is monopsony capitalism when it was emerging in the 70s and 80s and a very asymmetrical, fragmented kind of production system versus the system you're describing today, where in cases like Bangladesh and China and elsewhere, we have far more consolidated suppliers and intermediaries like these trading companies. And I think what Matthew was raising and Dev as well about the platform economy, as you know, is a further maybe change in the system. So final question, does platform economy mean we've moved away from monopsony capitalism to a significant degree, where you've got a gig economy set of workers who aren't really well organized? So I think those are just pushing the theoretical, I think, implications of your argument to the present day would be really helpful in terms of how the concept of monopoly capitalism last over the last 3 or 4 decades. Has the changes we've seen changed the nature of monopsony capitalism such that you now need a different term? Let me stop there.
Great, thanks. Ashok, we started a bit late due to the technical problems, and I think between the various critics and Gary's comments as well, I'm not seeing any further queries in the chat coming up. So I suggest that we come back to you and that you're not going to be able to address all the issues that have been raised, but that's because they're major challenging issues, and it's also because the book itself raises major challenging issues. But if you could at least respond to the key points.
Great.
you.
Yes, thank you very much.
And Ashok, sorry to interrupt. There's just one question in the chat. So
Oh, I
that's
didn't
what
see
I'm
it.
responding from Valentina in the question and answer box. There's a question.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Could you read? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Sorry, I'll read it out to you. So Valentina says, do you see any chance for getting out of sweatshop to come from the consumption side? Platforms are allowing also customers, citizens to place powerful requests, e.g. the Reddit case.
Okay, thank you very much for all those comments. I think, yeah, I think there's firstly the twilight of the sweatshop age is a title. I suppose it is very. I mean, it's provocative. Anouisha can attest to the fact that I went back and forth on whether to say it or not say it. I guess it's sort of. I'll take some of the points from Jen first. I agree with a lot of what you say. I think that it's I think that cases should be looked at as kind of just trying to understand potential trends and what it means for it. It's kind of like meant to be sort of Weberian ideal types in the sense of it's like these are extreme examples that can tell us what change looks like and what these most standardized or valorized sections of the sector that's already a starter sector. So it's kind of looking at indications in a sector that's already indications of broader trends and where capitalism is going, right? At least spatially. But I think it's the cases are the fact that it wasn't successful, I don't think is an indication of course, it wasn't fully successful. That's true. The Huyan case in China, but it was successful in Vietnam, and that was because it was demanded on the state. But that being said, the test wasn't whether it's successful or not. The test is more, and I think the critique is valid, but it's the test is how does capital respond, and what does that tell us about capital, and what is it that we know that's different about these sectors from other sectors? There is a reason. I mean, like labor process theory has maybe the opposite way of analyzing this, lots of the primary theories around that, but there is a reason why, I mean, to put it simply, the auto sector and aeronautic sectors, it's very gendered, it's lots of other those factors, but why they have much greater bargaining power than sectors that a factory can shut down and it's vertically disintegrated. It's, and if it's moving in the direction of greater investment, less sort of globalizability, then there's a potential. That's what I guess that's the argument, is that there's a potential. And that's where the third case comes in, which is kind of a break from, it's saying, here's a sector, this is the Honduran case, Fruit of the Loom. Here's a sector that is vertically integrated precisely because of the product that's being produced and precisely because of the standardization. And that might also contribute to why other sectors that are more valorized. So for example, in footwear, there's a reason why major brands in recent years, I mean, they haven't gone through with it. I think the pandemic disrupted a lot of this, but plans to kind of build semi-integrated, almost fully automated, not fully automated, but very automated factories in Europe for Adidas and Nike and other brands like that. So it speaks to the potential direction of travel, and I guess that's kind of that's the purpose of the cases. And around I guess the question of the growing power of employers associations, you see this specifically around the pandemic, and I'm thinking of Korea, I'm thinking of Cambodia and Bangladesh, where the employers associations really asserted quite a bit of power. And that's not an automatic relationship. I'm not suggesting that there's some kind of profit sharing agreement between these associations, but it is the case that if we again look to why if we ask the question, why are these sectors, why are these sweatshops so durable, and what are the component parts that make them durable? And then we say, okay, it's these factors. It's the fact that it's vertically disintegrated, that there's monopsony relationship, that it's greater buyer driven, that they can cut and run, that there's low value, that there's low technology, all of these factors that lead to the sweatshop, or what we call the sweatshop. If that's what leads to it, and if some or all of those things are being disrupted or are changing, then the presumption or the natural, the assumption that we can draw some conclusions that says, okay, maybe we're moving out of this period. And I think it's important what you said about the ILGW and the global jobless agreement. I guess this doesn't necessarily come in confrontation with that, because despite the growing power of suppliers, of course, we're not saying, of course, the suggestion isn't that these suppliers are at the power or even near the power of the brands. It is that the brands are increasingly reliant on suppliers when they historically weren't reliant on particular suppliers. And this is similar to arguments you've made around, the ILGW focusing on backbone shops in I guess England won. I can hear the honks. The backbone shops where the ILGW used to focus on the shops that were really important to the jobbers at that point. And it could completely work with a global kind of strategy that says, there's certain factories, like certain, let's say we want to organize the denim sector. Well, we're going to organize Arvind, and we're going to organize a few other big suppliers, because then it becomes really important. And then we'll put pressure on the brands, because then it becomes very difficult to replace those places, and that pressure can be laid bare. So I guess it's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily come into conflict with I don't think it comes into conflict necessarily with the theory put forward in the book, but I do agree with a lot of I do think that there are, lots of unknowns. I think the question around financialization, again, I guess it depends on what you mean by that. I mean, the auto sector has been financialized, really since in the US, at least in the 60s and 70s, a lot of their profits are made through APR financing. That wasn't the factor that changed the bargaining power of workers. It did lead to greater consolidation of firms, but yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by that specifically. To Dev's point, which does speak to some of the points that Jen brought up, that a perfect example of this, you brought up Arvind, Gokuldas Exports in India, huge brand, doesn't produce, is doing this sort of simple production of fabric that you suggested. And the rate of return, of course, but I think the focus on rate of return is not what, I don't deny that the rate of return is 8 to 10%. The point is that if your rate of return is 8 to 10% and you're a small firm, the rate in absolute terms is much less in terms of how much you're accruing, how much, how many return, in absolute terms is far greater if you're a Gokuldas Exports than if you're a small firm. That in absolute terms can then be reinvested into labor saving technology or R&D and change the conditions in the longer term. That's what the cases are meant to say. It's saying, look, when you have certain parts of the sector that are more valorized, that are more standardized, that are more consolidated and are consolidating more quickly because of the product that's being produced, that then is invested in labor saving technology, which increases the barriers to entry to other firms, which then increases the possibility for workers to disrupt at the point of production. That's I guess but the point isn't necessarily, and again, this is to Dev's point, why is Arvind different? Arvind's, it's different because of these particular factors. And the point isn't I'm not making a kind of, teleological argument here. It's not to say that the sort of changing composition, it's not to say that it just naturally happens. This isn't a neoclassical argument of saying, oh, well, profits increase naturally, that will trickle down to workers. I'm saying, actually, if this trend expands across the sector, that means that it's both the changing composition of capital, changing composition of the supply chains and suppliers within them, and the subjective agency of the working class or the workers to organize themselves and put that pressure and make demands on their employer. The point is that you can't make the reason why Arvind workers are making 10 to 15% more, and it might seem like much, it isn't a significant amount, but it is an amount, or is because, of course, it's also not an argument of a class struggle argument of saying, okay, you can make whatever demands. You can make the demands on what's available. That's what workers can make demands on. To Matt's point, I appreciate really trying to expand the ideas around this kind of logic to platforms, and this speaks to Gary's points as well, but I really don't, yeah, I can't, it's an important point. I'd like to like think about that more. And it's been asked a few times in different talks around the book. I don't know how I don't know those sectors well enough to think I think about sort of industrial production. I haven't really seen that kind of platformization of that in at least in labor intensive production. So on the question of underdevelopment, I still, it doesn't really change the fact. I mean, Foxconn has greater power than really any supplier in the garment sector. That doesn't necessarily mean that Apple doesn't have an exploitative relationship with those workers, or even an asymmetrical relationship with Foxconn. And that doesn't change the dynamic or the developmental questions in where Foxconn is. And so, yeah, I guess lastly to the question around regulation and Gary's point around, I think that the second point of the theory of saying, look, there's two forms of spatial inflexibility, regulatory and market, isn't to discount the importance of the state. It's to say that actually what put limits on the monopsonistic relationship between capital and between brands and suppliers was in fact regulation. First, it was state regulation. Of course, capitalism hasn't developed enough to even have the kind of necessarily states and capitalists within it to invest in and become sort of profitable capitalists. But at that period, maybe in the 1940s, 50s, in certain parts of the world, but it was largely because of the limits placed on capital by the state. So in terms of its own borders, but also in terms of the MFA. So it's not to discount the importance of regulation, of course not, but it's to say that that there isn't much evidence, especially if you consider the effect that regulation has. I mean, you have, for example, like the example that I know I'm running late. I'll just say this: the example that Jen brought up, or even Deb brought up on Bangladesh. It's like, 78% of their economy relies on, or their export-oriented economy is based on in the garment sector. It's not just that the state is just blindly trying to obviously exploit workers. It's that if they increase the cost even nominally, they may see a reduction in the amount of the number of companies and transnational firms and brands and retailers that outsource to Bangladesh. So it's not to downplay the role of regulation. It's that regulation is, obviously we know this, that it's becomes very hard to implement. And this goes back again also to the kind of social clause question. And a lot of people have done work on this, obviously, but I don't know many models in which it actually works. So I guess I guess I'll just end with this. I think it's more, and I want to go back to this, is that the purpose of the book is to try and think about what strategies have worked and what strategies haven't worked. And then secondly, what's potentially changing within the sector, within industrial capitalism, and how do we strategize that takes into the consideration those changing possibilities, or those changing conditions. Thank you.
Right. Ashok, thank you so much, and thanks for a really interesting overview, and also for some great comments. I think these are from all the different critics. I think everybody definitely admires the book, but you've raised some major issues and which have been flagged by them, and I think your response has been great as well. So I'm just going to put it up. So everybody needs to get it. Monopsony Capitalism, Power and Production in the Twilight of the Sweatshop Age. And I should say it's published by Cambridge University Press as part of the series Development Trajectories in Global Value Chains. And there are a number of different books which look at different dimensions of value chains. This is certainly a very, very important contribution to that series. So thank you to all, and I'll pass back to Anne Wisher on behalf of Cambridge University Press to wrap up this Author Meets the Critics.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I have spammed the chat section quite a lot with all the titles that are there in the series so far, some also from the forthcoming titles. Please take a look at the series at Cambridge Core, where you can get open access for certain books. And thank you once again. That is all from us. And we should certainly arrange more of these kind of sessions, because this has been quite innovative in a way, and we haven't really done anything of this sort before. So press will be looking
and also,
forward.
Anusha, do you want to just say about the recording will go up, or an edited version of will go up?
In just a week, I think. I will circulate the link as soon as it is up on our YouTube channel of the press.
Right. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you,
have a
everyone.
good evening. And England
Thanks,
won 4-0.
Well, it's time for me to get up here in India.
And thank you for being up so late as well, for those of you in Asia.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. See you
Bye.
again.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.